It was a stormy night in 2001, and the rain fell in sheets, drenching everything in its path. My grandfather, a man of simple routines and early nights, was unusually late returning home at that evening. He had been visiting a friend in a neighboring village, and the only route home took him through a dense and eerie forest that had long been the subject of many local legends. As he approached the edge of the forest, the road grew narrower and the trees loomed larger, their twisted branches forming ghostly shapes against the dark sky. The rain drummed relentlessly on the roof of his car, but my grandfather was a steady man, not easily unnerved. Yet as he neared the heart of the forest, something strange caught in his eye. A light, faint at first, but growing brighter as he drew closer. Curiosity taught at him, and against his better judgment, he pulled over to the side of the road. The light seemed to emanate from deep within the forest, far from the safety of the road. Grabbing his umbrella, he stepped out into the rain and began to follow the glowing beacon, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fascination. As he walked deeper into the forest, the light grew more intense, and soon he found himself standing before a scene that defied all logic. In a clearing surrounded by ancient, gnarled trees, a wedding was taking place. The air was filled with the sound of music and laughter, and the scent of rich, exotic food wafted through the air. But something about the scene was off, terribly off. The people at the wedding were unlike any my grandfather had ever seen. They were unnaturally tall, standing at least 7 or 8 feet higher, with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their movements were eerily graceful, as if they were not bound by the same laws of nature as ordinary humans. Despite the strangeness of the scene, my grandfather found himself drawn to it. He stepped closer, trying to blend in with the crowd, but it was impossible to ignore the strange, otherworldly aura that surrounded the gathering. The trees themselves seemed alive, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead, blocking out the sky and trapping him within the visa world. Suddenly a large figure appeared before him, throwing over the others. The man or the creature was dressed in elaborate robes that shimmered in the dim light, and his eyes burned with a cold, predatory intensity. Without a word, the man gestured for my grandfather to follow him, and as if under a spell, he compelled his legs moving on their own accord. The figure led him to a massive hall, far grander and more imposing than anything my grandfather had ever seen. The walls were made of dark stone, and the ceiling was so high it seemed to disappear into the shadows. At the far end of the hall stood a throne, and on it sat a man who could only be described as royalty. He was dressed in a rich, dark fabrics, and his face was obscured by shadows. But there was no mistaking the power of that radiation from him. The man on the throne spoke, his voice a deep, resonated echo that filled the hall. "You have stumbled into our world," he said, his words laced with an accent my grandfather couldn't place. "This is not a place of your kind, yet here you are." My grandfather, trembling with fear, tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The kingly figure continued, his grace pricing. "You have seen too much, mortal. The wedding you witnessed is not of your world, but ours. an event that marks an union between two peaceful jinns. You do not belong here. Before my grandfather could process the gravity of this situation, the figure waved his hand, and a wave of darkness washed over him. He felt his consciousness slipping away, and the last thing he saw was the cold, unforgiving face of the king. When he awoke, he was lying on the damp forest floor. The rain is still falling around him. The clearing, the wedding, the strange beings, everything was gone, as if it had never existed. Only the faint echo of the music remained, lingering in the back of his mind like a distinct memory. Dazed and terrified, my grandfather struggled to his feet and made his way back to the road. His clothes were soaked and his body ached from the cold, but all he could think about was getting away from the cursed place. When he finally reached home, he collapsed into a chair, shivering from more than just cold. He never spoke of that night to anyone, fearing that no one would believe him, or worse, that speaking of it might somehow bring the jinns' wrath upon him. But the memory of that night haunted him for the rest of his days. The wedding in the forest, the strange beings, the powerful king. He could never forget the terror of that encounter, and though he tried to push it from his mind, there was always a lingering doubt, a fear that one day he might accidentally cross the boundary into the world again. And if he did, he knew there would be no coming back.